Good morning. Thanks for attending the BC Sans webinar, a new font for gov.bc.ca and digital services. Andrew and Davis will be taking you through the new font. The talk will take about 30 to 45 minutes, so type your questions in throughout, and we'll answer them for the last 15 to 20 minutes. A survey will come right around the end of the presentation. Please fill it out. It helps us know what we can do better and other potential talks that you would like to hear. So thank you, and Davis.
Great. Can you just confirm once again that you can hear all right? Just want to make sure before we get going. Okay, great. So yeah, thank you for coming and hearing about the new font for gov.bc and other digital services. My name is Davis Levine, and I'm a team lead with the service design team in Government Digital Experience and Citizen Services. And we have Andrew Pratt here. I'll let Andrew introduce himself.
Hi, folks. I'm Andrew Pratt. I'm Director of Graphic Communications here at Government Communications and Public Engagement. And Davis and I have been working on BC Sans for the past several months, and we're to present this to you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, we're really excited. There's been a lot of work and analysis in this, and so we're really happy that we can share this with everyone here and answer any questions you have. So to start off, let's jump over to what BC Sans looks like. And so here's a quick overview of what the new font looks like. And for people that aren't huge font nerds, you probably won't notice what's special or different about this, but we'll be going through the different reasons why this is a unique typeface and the value that it provides us as a government. And so before we get into the details of this font, let's actually talk about what was the problem that we were trying to solve here. So the current brand standard for web was called Myriad Pro. And as we were looking at how we could support teams to build digital services and provide them with the resources and fonts that they need, we found that there was a couple of issues. So first, even though Myriad is a well-designed and extensive font, there was some lack of support in different languages, and specifically in Indigenous languages. Myriad Pro is also a licensed font from Adobe, and so that just starts to create some restrictions on how easily we're able to distribute the font across government to different teams cheaply and easily. And we were really finding that with a lot of open source projects happening in government and needing to share resources with external contractors, we needed a font that could be easily distributed to lots of different people. And so that has led us to what we now call BC Sans. And this is a really awesome typeface that has a lot of cool characteristics to it. So one is that it supports a diversity of language speakers in the province and is designed to support over 800 languages. And so Andrew and I did not design this font years, making sure that it was built for those languages. BC Sans is really a modified version of a font from Google called Noto Sans. And that font was specifically designed to support the world's languages. And so that was a really good starting place in our analysis around language support. And so we took Noto Sans, and it's an open source font, which means that it was free for us to use. There was no cost associated with it. And we did some analysis and were able to make specific changes on it so that we could support the Indigenous languages found in British Columbia. Another great aspect of it is that this font was built specifically for the web. And so the design is a lot more readable and legible on a variety of screen sizes. And we'll get into a little bit more of the granularity of the font design and how that supports readability. And so what we first want to talk about is language support and how fonts can support the diversity of languages that we find in British Columbia. And so roughly there's about 26% of British Columbians that speak a non-official language as their mother tongue. And so there's a lot of people in BC that need to access government services in different languages, feel comfortable reading and speaking in different languages. And so we want to have a font that works across these languages to create a cohesive brand for governments, no matter which language you read content in. And so having this font that has that visual consistency and look and feel across different languages was really important in that analysis. And so we're continuing to look at how we can support multi-language service delivery. But what we really want to focus on and what is unique to this font is how it supports Indigenous languages that are found in BC. And I want to just go and provide a little bit of backstory about kind of why I'm passionate about this, and to talk about how choices we make in a digital context can really impact our efforts around reconciliation and in these areas. So about 2 years ago, I came across this tweet from Chelsea Vowles, who is a Métis scholar in the Edmonton region. And she was doing an analysis around different provinces' ability to support Indigenous languages. And this was related to the Call to Action 17, which was calling upon all levels of government to enable residential school survivors and their families to reclaim their names that were changed by the residential school system. And so she had gone through different provinces, looking at their different applications and policies, and came across British Columbia that only allowed names with the Roman alphabetic letters and things found in a kind of standard French accent system. But recognizing that BC is home to a lot of unique languages, specifically Indigenous languages. So that was a failure on our part to be able to support that, and represents how the choices we make in terms of how we're choosing technology and these kind of things can directly impact our ability to meet those calls to actions. And so when I saw this tweet, I was quite inspired by it. I've always kind of had a passion for rendering Indigenous languages through fonts on the web, through past research. And so I contacted her and said, hey, I'll look into the regulations, I'll look into the act and see if there's any barriers, and I'll look at what we can do. And so I'm really happy that this work has moved forward, because I think this represents a lot of the work that we need to do. So when we look at language support for Indigenous languages, we've done a quick comparison between our original font Myriad Pro and BC Sans. And what you can see is when a browser or computer is trying to render a character that it doesn't recognize, so it's not found in that font family, it'll create these boxes that have X's in them, or sometimes they'll be empty. And so the reason why the original font Noto Sans was called Noto Sans is that it's a shortened version of No Tofu. And in the font community, that's what those boxes are called. So it's this attempt to eliminate this from ever happening. So when this happens and people are trying to render their name or a nation's name, this is really damaging, not being actually represent who you are in the written language that you have. And so on browsers, when this happens, what typically will occur is that the browser will attempt to find other fonts that support those characters. And so at best, you end up with a word that is a mismatch of different fonts, and the words start to look funky. And at worst, you can't even render the characters, and it becomes, you're not able to even read it. And so when we looked at Noto Sans looking to make it into BC Sans, we did an analysis of where there were these gaps, so where characters weren't rendering properly. We worked with First Voices to test the font on their website, and so that group is focused on Indigenous languages, and so that was a great resource for us to connect with. And we also connected with an Indigenous language linguist and font expert to help with that analysis, to identify where there were gaps and what modifications we needed to make. And so there weren't a ton of modifications that we needed to make, but in order to say that this font actually can support all of Indigenous languages in BC, it was really important that we made those modifications and built them into the font. And so there's a couple ways that Indigenous languages can be written. One is through what we call a Roman orthography, so kind of what we see in English and French. But there's also a set of characters called syllabics that you can see below for Cree. And so we need a font that supports both. And so here's just a sample of the syllabic glyphs and what they look like in BC Sans. The more, this isn't the full range, and there's also a lot of Roman letters that are used. And so we can see some examples here of the translation of the syllabics with Cree in the Roman orthography, and then in English with the different font weights. And so another really awesome aspect of this font is that it is open source. So it's really removing a lot of limitations for our use and access. And so with an open source font, it's free for us to use. So there's no cost to actually use this font. So that's really great for us. And because it's open source, we can give the font to anyone inside and outside of government. So if you're a group that needs to use this specifically for Indigenous languages, it's free to access. And if you have communities or organizations outside of government, they're also free to use it as they wish. And because it's open source, we can make any more modifications that we need to identify if there are any missing characters. So we tried our best to do a full analysis to see what we needed to change in order to support languages in BC. But if we find that there are some gaps in characters, we are able to continue to make more modifications and improve it as we need to. So that's been really great. So now I'm going to turn it over to Andrew Pratt, and he's just going to talk about the font design and how the characteristics of the font can improve readability and legibility on the web.
Thanks. I'm just going to go over a few of the basics of type design and the background of our corporate fonts and why and how BC Sans is going to be integrated. What you'll see on the screen is comparison of serif and sans-serif typefaces. Adobe Garamond and Adobe Myriad are the province's official typefaces per the corporate visual identity and represent our brand in our published communications, including documents and advertising. Garamond is a serif typeface. Myriad is a sans-serif typeface. And you'll see on the right of the screen, as serifs are those little caps and stems that you see on the top and bottom of the letters, letter forms. Sans-serif, of course, does not have these. Garamond and Myriad are both commercially licensed software. Myriad has been used on the Gov website for several years to be consistent with our visual brand. And while Myriad is highly readable, it was not ideal because it is a commercially licensed typeface costing us money, which restricts the scope and variety of uses required, such as that by third-party developers, which require additional or special licenses. Adobe Garamond, being a serif typeface, is favored for excellent readability in print publications, especially books. However, on screen, the serifs can appear to blend individual characters together, especially at smaller sizes, making Garamond an unsuitable choice for accessibility. So sans-serif, meaning without a serif, typefaces, are widely preferred for on-screen use. There are hundreds of typefaces, though these can be generally categorized grotesque and neo-grotesque. geometric, and humanist. The grotesque was named because it wasn't considered very beautiful in comparison to the old black letter and handwritten scripts. Geometric, of course, are very perfect in their design in regard to very straight edges and very round shapes. The humanist typefaces, though, typically have a less rigid construction and are not as tied to historical time frames as the grotesque and geometric typefaces. Humanist typefaces are often perceived as a little more friendly and neutral in personality. Myriad works well in our communications because of those qualities. So BC Sans, which is based on Google's Noto Sans, as David Davis mentioned, is also a humanist typeface, and it has a similar character and personality to Adobe Myriad, though it has a number of details which actually improve its readability on screen. The individual letters, or glyphs, are a little wider than Myriad's, and the lowercase is a little taller. This is referred to as X height. Our brains don't read the letters which form the words we read. Rather, our brains identify the shape of the word as we skim across a sentence. The additional space within and between the individual letters in BC Sans improve the clarity and definition of the word shape and add to its readability. BC Sans made an ideal candidate to replace Myriad on our website. We looked at a large number of fonts, and BC Sans rose to the top for a number of reasons. The improved readability because of its design, the open source availability, the support for over 800 languages, the ability to customize the typeface to include Indigenous characters and glyphs, and the ability to redistribute it freely were clearly significant. And logically, this made the choice to adopt BC Sans a worthwhile effort. The project was done largely in-house with minimal cost, and it reflects our ongoing commitment to improving services for the public. Improvements in readability, accessibility, inclusiveness, cost efficiency, and technical performance are the results. So what we're looking at now is a comparison between Myriad Pro and BC Sans, and while the letter forms are very similar, you'll see the differences are quite distinct. The larger X height, as mentioned, is the height from the base of the letter to the top of the lowercase letter is taller in BC Sans, which make it a little more readable, especially at small sizes. This is, as they say, this is especially important for mobile devices. The characters are also slightly wider, making more internal space to help with definition of the letter forms and therefore reading. Certain letters are designed to be more distinguished. For example, the capital I won't be mistaken for a lowercase L. And you'll see the capital I is really the only letter within the sans-serif font to include a serif. But you'll also notice it makes it very distinct from the lowercase L. This is what I sometimes call a squint test, and it's actually a test to replicate a low vision condition. And you'll see that BC Sans is more readable than Adobe Myriad. So some characteristics of the font again to expand on this. BC Sans characters, they're a little wider than Myriad with a taller X height, as mentioned. And also has shorter extenders and descenders on letters such as K, P, G. The descenders have an additional curve to them, such as can be seen on the Y and the G, which improves recognition and differentiation. Interesting note that Noto Sans is used on more than 2 million websites. So within the BC Identity Program, which is administered from this office, as mentioned, Adobe Myriad Pro and Garamond Pro are our corporate typefaces, and BC Sans will be added to the mix. So the use of BC Sans will be a phased approach. Myriad will continue to represent our brand on print publications and advertising, but because of BC Sans' similarity and compatibility with Adobe Myriad, it will continue to support our visual identity and branding online without much disruption. BC Sans will be phased into our corporate visual identity as well. It will become synonymous with BC government's online services and will find new purposes and uses which will take advantage of its special characteristics. Guidelines for use of BC Sans will also be available on the BC Visual Identity Program website. So the first phase will implement BC Sans on all digital service platforms. Modifications to font size and spacing have been made already to accommodate BC Sans. And no actions are required by program areas in respect to their web pages, though your pages should be checked to ensure everything still looks good. And GDX will be updating other sites and properties that GDX is responsible for. Second phase will see BC Sans made available online for all supporting government online services and third-party developers. It's to be incorporated in all new digital properties, and at the first opportunities such as maintenance or redevelopment on existing properties.
Okay, so in terms of where you can access the font software, the files themselves, there's a couple different avenues depending on what use you have. So there's two areas that you can download it. So one is from the BC Digital Design System, and you're able to download the fonts that you would need for use on the web. For development teams, we also have different ways that you can consume the font through an NPM package. So for the developers, you know what that means. And there's also a JavaScript kind of plugin called typography.js. That is another way that you can incorporate the font into your application. And there'll be more detailed guidance around typography and sizing coming soon. And you can also get the font for use in print, which would be optimally what's called the .ttf file, the true type, and could be downloaded on the Visual Identity Program website. And so an important thing to note is that even though for most purposes, Noto Sans and BC Sans are relatively the same, it's really important that we do not use the Google Font API for Noto Sans. Using that API violates our privacy policies around personal information and data tracking. And so, yeah, we can't use that access method. So we try to put in place different ways that teams can use it that would be just as seamless. In this transition, we've seen different teams start using Noto Sans through Google Fonts. And so we'll just be asking people to make that transition when it's appropriate over to using BC Sans. So yeah, just an important thing to note there. Another aspect that we haven't talked about is specifically for Indigenous languages is how you can actually type and access the glyphs or characters. And so typically if you need to or want to type in those languages, it requires the download and install of a keyboard. And And so First Voices has keyboards associated with all the different languages that they support. And we'll be looking at where we want to be kind of hosting that link to connect into those keyboards so that you'll be able to use those if you so choose. Anything to add, Andrea?
No, some software, like graphic design layout software, you can see all of the glyphs within the typeface. Other software like Word or something like that, you can't actually see the rest of the Indigenous glyphs. However, they're there, and as Davis mentioned, it requires downloading keyboard software and installing that to actually use.
Okay.
Ready for questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. First question is from Johnny. Can you speak to how this font will affect PDF form development? We use Arial because it's on everyone's system. Do you foresee any change in the fonts we use?
Yeah, when you're creating a PDF, you can choose to embed the fonts that are used. You don't necessarily have to use Arial because it's installed on everybody's font. You actually have the option to embed just the letters that are used on your document, or you can embed the whole typeface. And anything in BC Sans, of course, you'll be able to embed in a PDF document, and hopefully in the near future, BC Sans will be installed in all of our government computers.
Great. Next question is from Nicholas. How will the new fonts interact with optical character recognition software?
Very good question.
Yeah. I would say I'm not well versed in optical character recognition and the technology behind that. I would make an assumption right now that because of the unique character design in BC Sans, like Andrew mentioned, how the capital I is differentiated from the L, it would make machine reading of the characters much more unique and distinct, and so that would improve the optical character recognition. But I'm not sure if there's further considerations from a technology perspective that is needed to support that.
Well, that's very true for the Roman characters used in the Indigenous languages. However, the syllabic glyphs will not be able to be read using OCR. Similar with screen readers, if most screen readers have technology for specific languages built into it. So none of the screen readers that I'm familiar with have the capability to read the Indigenous languages yet, but I understand these are in development.
Thanks. James, what plan is in place for government services that are not on the BC Gov site? For example, Student Aid BC has a standalone site.
So yeah, that was the piece identified in the phase 2 of this is as standalone sites are being maintained or redeveloped, that's the opportunity to switch over to BC Sans. I think regardless if your service is found on the Gov platform or off of it, they still need to align to government standards and branding. So I think it's more of a question of when that change will occur.
Yeah, and the good thing about that is that BC Sans will be served from your dedicated server. It's not being served from a remote server or one that's in the United States or somewhere else. It'll be able to be served from your server with the rest of the website files.
Thank you. From Richard, are the branding guidelines getting updated as well?
Yes, indeed. The branding guidelines will be updated. That's underway right now, and BC Sans will be the only website to be used on government websites, and it will be part of the brand standards in that respect. As the use of BC Sans expands, certainly for desktop use, it may play an even larger role within our brand standards.
For Michael, you've mentioned it's open source, and will it be freely distributed? Can you confirm if that applies to the general public as well?
Yes, it can be. So there's an open source license that is associated to it. And so if someone from the public or someone else wants to use it, as long as they continue to follow that license and what the license places on it, then they're free to use it.
Yeah, the open source license, basically means you can do almost anything to the font, except you can't sell it. You can't include it in a collection of fonts to be sold.
Great. From Gregory. For HTML pages, will BC Sans be a web-safe font? First preference, followed by Calibri and then Sans.
Yeah, so BC Sans, I think there's a specific definition of what's considered a web-safe font. So BC Sans will be loaded with the service that when it's being accessed online. So a web-safe font is typically a font that is defined on people's computers, and so every computer is able to read it. So BC Sans will be part of that service package, so it'll be read. If for whatever reason there is an error or it's not able to read the font files, there will be a font stack that's defined of what the fallback would be. And so that's the kind of Calibri and Sans that you mentioned in the question. Yeah.
Yep.
From Josh, does BC Sans have an extended family of fonts like Myriad Pro? Example, condensed, semi-condensed, light, extended, etc.
Yes and no. So the original font Noto Sans, in the kind of early release versions, they have different font weight families around condensed and semi-condensed. Those families typically aren't used on the web. Loading all those different fonts really increases the size of the download package. As BC Sans becomes more embedded within our brand guidelines, I think then we could be exploring how we could pull in those different weights and families for print, but they typically aren't used for like digital services on the web. You want to add anything?
Yeah, that's right. And for the time being, Myriad Pro will still be the brand font for any kind of print materials. And of course, that full range of weights and styles will remain.
Great. From Kim, is there a visual of the full font set somewhere?
Yeah, I think when you say the full font, the number of glyphs are in the hundreds, and so getting one screenshot of that is it can definitely be done. I think if you have a specific purpose of why you want that kind of full view of it, we can talk and see the best way of setting that up.
Yeah, I have created one, and as Davis mentioned, it's about six screenshots. And if this is of interest to you, I'd be more than happy to provide it. Just send me an email.
Okay. From Shannon, as you mentioned just now, is there a plan for the fonts to be automatically installed on all government computers? My understanding is that you may use the BC Sans font in Word, but if someone opens the file and does not have BC Sans installed, a different font will be be displayed and could cancel out the hard work done to support hundreds of languages.
Yeah, so that's been an idea that we've looked into, and we'll continue to look in, is if we can get the font automatically downloaded on all supported computers. You're right, if you were to download it and use it for yourself on a Word document and then send that document to someone else and they don't have that font installed, it would just pick up a different font to use. And that's why for right now this is primarily to be used just on the web for digital services, and as it becomes more used widely, we'll look at the support to get it on people's computers, so there's less risk of that with print or on Word documents.
Yeah, that's true, but there are techniques for actually embedding the font in a Word document. It's just a couple of settings, and we'll be providing information on how to do that, where you can download the font on the BC Visual Identity Program website.
So from Pip, sorry if you went over this, if someone hasn't downloaded the BC Sans font, will they see tofu or the X boxes for certain characters, including the public, not just within government?
It depends on what context it's being used in. So if it's if you were to use this in a graphics program like Indesign and you attempted to put in those characters for language that, or for a non-supported character, then you would see the tofu boxes. If you were to send that if you were to send it, say, in a Word document, the tofu boxes probably, when it comes up, they would attempt to find a different font that's installed on that person's computer. And so it can sometimes look like a mismatch of different fonts being put together, unless that on that person's computer specifically they have no font that's locally installed that can read that character, then you would get the tofu box. So computers will try to fall back on different fonts. And if there's nothing locally installed, then you'll get the tofu box. So it's really dependent on the computer that's trying to access it. So it could be quite tricky.
From Nicholas, how would one access the Indigenous characters in apps like Word? Do we need to use the character map, or is there a faster way?
So this goes to the keyboard access in terms of being able to type in the Indigenous characters. So there are keyboards that are developed that you would need to install on your computer that have been developed by First Voices. And so if you needed to type in that language, you can install that keyboard and figure out the key mapping to be able to type. In Word, you could, as a quick method, is to copy and paste characters that you need, but that's not the ideal way of going about it. There's some issues with that. I think sometimes there's a glyph picker in Word, but that's also a really laborious process. And so the best way would be to install Word, and we'll be putting up links and references of where and how you can access those keyboards in the near future.
Yeah, and swapping out keyboards is many people will be familiar with switching from English to a French keyboard, and you'll be able to do that the same way. All of the BC Sans aligned with Unicode, so if you know Unicode, you'd be ahead of the game in actually using the font for typing. Although that's not a comfortable method for most people.
From Astra, in phase 2, does the alignment also apply to BC government online apps?
Yes.
Yes.
Easy. Gillian, how can other levels of government, regulators, health authorities access the font to use it?
So from the same place that the BC government would be accessing it, through either the BC Design system on the typography page or from the BC Identity Program website. um, whether they're public crown corporations or health authorities, they can access it from that location.
From Brenda, if I use the font in a SharePoint site with others view this font as another.
Not sure the question.
Yeah. If I use the font in a SharePoint site with others view, will others view this font as another?
It's something else like Calibri or Arial.
I'm not sure if that's asking for the SharePoint site for the whole site or documents within the site. So I think you can customize SharePoint based on my limited knowledge of SharePoint. So you could update the font so that I could render it, but I'm not.
So do they read the screen or convert to what their computer has?
Would it swap out BC Sans for something else that's installed?
Yeah, if a computer for whatever reason can't read the font that is being called to be loaded, it'll swap out to a different font.
Yeah, because SharePoint is web-based.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Great. Michael, follow-up question from earlier. Expected timeline for availability to public or open source release. I'd love to get my hands on it and start exploring it a bit further.
Yeah, so it's available right now to access on those two locations. So the BC design system. Yeah, you can download the fonts right now from there, or use the different installation methods for developers, as well as the fonts will be going up on the BC Identity Program website. So they're able to be used right now.
Yeah, we don't have the dedicated page up on the Visual Identity website yet, but that will be up and running with as much information as we can cram on there within a week.
Last question as of right now from Amy. Will BC Sans be available to BC's Crown agencies?
Yeah, it'll be available.
Absolutely.
Okay. From Astra, to confirm your recommendation for PDFs that are available online, created in InDesign, is to not go ahead and revamp them with BC Sans at the moment.
No, you don't have to replace it with BC Sans for work that you've already done. But I think moving forward, if you could start using it for stuff that will be online, that would be the best way to do it, just for efficiency, and so we're not creating more work for people.
From Johnny, do you know offhand if most employees can install fonts themselves, or is that locked down?
I don't think it's locked down, but on some computers they might be.
Yeah, the computers used to be highly managed and require their local IT people to either push it or install it specifically for people. Other folks have got a little more access and can install fonts. So it depends on your local group. But our hope is very soon that it will be installed or made easily installed on all government computers.
I know for mine, it just took a couple of minutes. It was easy to set up.
Hmm.
For Pip, so this is still focused on web use, or is there a serif font in the works for print materials to keep both print and web looking uniform?
There will be the Sans-Serif version of BC Sans available on the BC Visual Identity Program website that's specifically for print purposes. Right now, it's being required for online services and products, but again, our hope is that it will gain momentum and use of print materials. And so the answer is yes.
Not a question, but thanks, Kim. I just installed it in about a minute. Great. James, will there be a requirement to use BC Sans to type the proper names of Indigenous places on maps?
Good one.
I wouldn't say it's a requirement. But,
That's certainly a goal.
yeah.
Okay, do we have any other questions? You should notice that within a minute or two, all the surveys will be sent to you. Again, please take a moment to fill it out. Tell us what you like. Tell us what you'd like to see better in the future, and ideas of what else you'd like to hear for webinars and Lab and Learns. Thanks for attending, and thanks Andrew and Davis.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.